Okay, it is 2:30. Chair Sutton is on his way, but we might as well get started because we have a big schedule. So Superintendent Moore?
So our first item on the work session today is to answer some additional questions about the budget in preparation for asking the board to vote on their proposed budget in the board meeting later today. I'll turn it over to David Nieder and his team.
Okay. Good afternoon, Vice Chair Mahaffey, board members, and Superintendent Moore. As the superintendent just stated, this afternoon's the second work session the board will have to discuss the proposed 21-22 operating budget. We'll begin with an overview of some additional board member questions that have come in regarding the budget and staff responses. And then after that, we'll turn it over to the board for your further discussion and any direction to make changes to the proposed budget. We have an action item on your board meeting agenda for tonight to approve the board's proposed budget, assuming you reach consensus during the work session. And if not, the board will need to schedule an additional meeting to approve the proposed budget to meet the statutory deadline of submitting the proposed budget to the county. We'll point out that the county manager presented his proposed budget to the county commissioners last evening, and the amount of county appropriation is not 100% aligned with what's contained in the current Wake County Public Schools proposed budget. And I share that with you now just for information, as any discussion related to reconciliation or adjustments to align the two budgets will take place after the county commissioners adopt a final budget for next year. One last thing before I turn it over to Ms. Kimsey to provide that high-level overview of the additional board member questions. Based upon what we heard in board discussion 2 weeks ago, we provided two separate possible budget adjustments for your consideration. The first is an increase in the use of federal one-time funds to apply against the maintenance and operations budget for the 2021-2022 year. Several of you commented on that. And the second is the use of one-time federal funding to accelerate implementation of the deferred multi-year plan to positively impact the non-certified pay scale. So we just put that out for consideration. And with that, I will turn it back over to Ms. Kimsey.
Good afternoon. We have a few more questions to go over. The first one is concern about our athletic fields and facilities around the district and the inequity that we see at some of our older, more established schools. Funding for those projects are generally provided through the capital improvement program rather than the operating budget. The capital improvement budget is currently a 7-year rolling plan and is coincidentally being presented at your work session today. The relatively new PRIMP program and funding line item is an example of how the district is working towards addressing the stated concern. Recent discussion in facilities committee meetings about school facility evaluation rubrics have also touched on managing this concern. It's not typically an item that would be funded through the operating budget. So the next question is, could we have a breakdown of the local funds and what it could mean for our non-certified pay? Specifically, what would those funds translate to for each non-certified employee? Pay scale adjustment by grade and step. So to provide context, there's currently $6.4 million in the local operating budget recommended to apply against our non-certified pay schedule. It's part of a multi-year plan. In the first year of our multi-year plan, we used $7.7 million, and we were able to provide a 3% across-the-board adjustment for our non-certified staff, and we were able to provide a minimum $15 rate for our bus drivers for a 6-month period that first year, and we addressed compression within the bus driver pay grade. The next year, this year, we were able to continue the $15 minimum for bus drivers for a full year, We had to add 1.6 million to make that an annual cost rather than 6 months. So once we know how much local funding we have available to apply to our non-certified pay schedules, and once we know what the state will legislate, because we don't know right now if they're going to do non-certified pay adjustments, bonuses, some combination of both. Once we have all of those pieces, we will bring forward a recommendation that will show you what's required by pay grade to bring our non-certified staff to a $15 minimum rate, and a recommendation about what we may choose to do with the funding available for next year. The next question is a question about variables in motion, but helpful to know what type of impact the non-certified employees, the increased funding would have. Can any possibilities be provided? Also noticing that more money is proposed for their pay up to $10 million. And additionally, isn't the 3% state legislative amount accounted for in a different area of the budget, or is that part of the $6.4 million? So those are really two independent things. We've estimated in the budget that the state might approve a 3% raise. We have no idea what the state will do. That was just an estimate during our budget development process. And that's on page 72 of the superintendent's proposed budget. That 3% estimate includes a local amount of $2 million because some of our non-certified staff are locally funded. And if the state were to pay a 3% adjustment for state paid staff, we would need $2 million to pay that same for our locally funded staff. In addition, there is the deferred operational needs multi-year funding request of the $6.4 million. So that's really separate from what we're estimating the state may do. And that is the item that David has put forward a proposal for you all to consider today, that we could possibly increase that up to $10 million as a consideration for revising the superintendent's proposed budget. So the two cases are independent of each other in terms of dollars, but they're very dependent on each other in how we adjust our pay schedules. Until we know both what may be coming from the state and local, we need that information before we can bring you a good recommendation of how we would apply that to our salary schedules in this year of the multi-year implementation. And as we move forward each year, we would be adjusting the pay schedules different ways, but we can bring forward a proposal once we know that information. Once we bring you a proposal, it would be retroactive to July 1, but it would be likely some time will pass before we do the recommendation, because we have to know what the county funding will be and what the state funding will be. If the state does not legislate a 3% increase, what happens to those funds? Would Wake County School System still provide the 3% that's being budgeted? Or if they come with a higher amount, what might be used to cover it? So on pages 11 and 12 in your budget, we've listed potential risk for next year. The first couple of sentences indicate that the biggest risk, which isn't really a risk, it's just that it's a variable that could change based on what we estimated, are the decisions that the General Assembly can make during the 2021 session. So it could go either way. If they approve pay increases less than what we've estimated, then that state number in the budget would decrease, because it really never existed. It's just an estimate. So once the state does approve a raise for state employees, we would adjust to their amount. The local amount, if they approve a raise less than what we had estimated, then the amount of local funding we have budgeted for that, say the $2 million for non-certified staff, if they approved a raise less than 3%, there would be extra dollars in that particular line item. There will be likely differences in a lot of the budget line items. So once we know a state budget, we analyze everything that we have projected against what comes in actually, and then we bring to the board recommended, or not recommended, a summary of the adjustments, where costs were either higher than lower than what the state did compared to our estimate. And there will be a net cost or savings that impacts decisions that we have to make about all of the things that are in the budget. So if the state approves a salary increase higher than the 3%, they would provide those resources for the state-funded employees, but we would need additional resources for the locally funded employees. But again, there would probably be other decisions that had happened in the state budget that would have costs that are higher or lower than estimated, and we would look at all of those together and bring back a summary, and then we would need to move forward with recommendations. So typically, the state does not finish their budget by the end of June. It usually goes on into the summer, occasionally into the fall. So at the end of June, we will likely recommend an interim budget resolution, as we have for several years, so that we can begin the school year doing our normal operations, but we will not have made final decisions at that point. We will wait. We will know the county appropriation that the commissioners approve by then. They will approve in June typically. We will probably not know the state budget. So it will be sometime in the summer, occasionally in the fall, when we have all of that information and we can bring it to you to adjust from an interim budget resolution to a true budget resolution. That's a typical process that's been going on now for several years. Regarding the budget reductions from the fall, there's a question about how many of those would be one time. Just asking to see a clear list, which is a good question, because those things are in a couple different places. So if you look at page 144 of the superintendent's proposed budget, there were $16.7 million of base budget reductions last fall. We are requesting in the superintendent's budget to reinstate those dollars into the budget, and we are asking to add those back from the ESSER to federal funding next year. And you see a list of those in the answer, a breakdown by the type of reduction that occurred last fall. In addition, at the end of the third quarter of this year, there was $7 million in net savings identified specifically that we have saved this year so far, and that was in your over-under local savings request at your recent board meeting. We believe there will be more savings by the time we get to the end of the fiscal year, because many of our departments and schools will underspend some of their line items based on the impact of the pandemic. I don't know those exact figures right now. The items that we have seen that we know are identifiable, that we can transfer the dollars and set them aside, are in the over-under local savings. But we feel certain there will be more savings by the end of the year. We won't know it until we get on the other side of our fiscal year and closeout. All of those dollars would roll to our fund balance, which is one reason we felt confident in the amount that we're recommending to appropriate for next year's budget from fund balance.
Ms. Kelsey, could you hold one second? I have one question.
Sure.
Mrs. Cash?
Yeah, I just want to be real clear on line items. So I know, like, when we're talking about non-certified salaries, and we are dependent on a proposed increase by our legislative. I think what I'm looking for, and I'm not sure if other board members are, that since we want to focus on this one line item specifically, if there is a savings, say that we do have a savings, we would like it to not be put somewhere else, but to be left in that line item plus the $10 million if we get to that today. If there is a loss in that line item because of an increased percentage given by the legislature, we would like to find that from somewhere else to put into that and still put the $10 million in. So I as one board member would like to look at that one line item as non-certified, that we don't take our $10 million and move it around, but, put the savings back in, not give it somewhere else, and not take money out from our $10 million to that line item.
Ms. Cash, the way something like what you're describing or what you are describing would be handled would, as we get to actual reconciliation of the budget, any adjustments that need to be made, what you're describing could be built into the budget at that point. And then the board would obviously have to approve it.
So what would that process be? Because I know that's, as one board member, that's how I feel that I'd like to approach our taking the bite out of non-certified salaries. But
it would be the same process that we go through with the board. And as Ms. Kinsey said, sometimes in the fall, I have one recollection, and a couple years back, it may have been as late as November or early December. But as we go back and we bring you the different things to adjust the budget, the board's budget, to the final state budget and the final county budget, including the county appropriation, what you're describing, if that's where the board chooses to go, that's where we could affect it. And obviously, any decisions related to compensation are made either just on the tail side of approving the budget, and so that would happen. And again, any changes to the compensation, they're generally retroactive back to July 1st. So even though they may not be happening until the fall, employees are made whole by getting a retroactive payment from July 1st of the year up until whenever the payment starts on a recurring basis, the change.
If I could add to that just a bit. So what I hear the board asking is, when we bring you scenarios to reconcile the budget, once we have an understanding that is firm of what the state has done, the local has done, et cetera, whenever that is after June 30th, that we include in the budget reconciliation for the board a scenario that maintains the dollars that we have set at this point that would go into non-certified, and you would see what the cost or what the movement of other dollars would need to be in order to do that, whether it's to the positive or to the negative, so that the board ultimately makes a decision on what they vote on.
Thank you, Superintendent Moore. I appreciate that.
Okay. Well, staff is here to answer any additional questions as you begin your discussion about the budget and any direction back to the superintendent and staff about any changes to the current proposed budget. I will point out it's a bit of a distinction, but the two options that we put out for the board to consider, I wouldn't call them recommendations on the part of staff or proposals. They're simply responses from staff to what we heard your discussion, what we heard from your discussion in your first work session. So we put those out there for your consideration.
All right, any questions, concerns, board members about the budget? Mrs. Cash?
So I did send out a suggestion about, and I think it kind of piggybacks on what Ms. Kushner had talked about earlier about what we do for our employees based on benefits to them. And I do feel like the Go Pass was something that we should look at for our employees. And I do know there's different feelings on what we want to do about benefits for our employees. I did say in my email that I did feel like transportation was an obstacle for a lot of our non-certified, especially CNS staff over the summer, as I watched them and actually took a few of them home when they didn't have transportation. They don't have more than, some don't even have any cars. Some have maybe one car. And I would love to be able to give them some options on that, so that was one of my suggestions.
Mr. Hagerty?
Thank you. And maybe Ms. Cash knows this. I've asked the representatives from the county government about the Go Pass issue, and I haven't received a full answer yet. But do you know how many of our schools are on transportation routes close to Go Pass?
Well, I do have a map of that, and I know not as many as I think you would like or most of us would like. The Go Pass is, for kids, that would be especially important. I know that the path for many of our employees would be for them to get to groceries or go to other locations and things like that. So I wasn't looking at necessarily for come to work, but for employees. But it has to be better than it is now. It needs to improve, as I think you definitely know as well as I do. But the Go Pass is only charged to us based on if they use it, and it's 40% of what the rate would be. If they use it, it would be billed to us. But I do think that we need to do a really better job of, especially for our students, as you've indicated. I think we need to get a lot more schools on that.
I appreciate that. As we've talked about, there are a lot of transportation challenges around the district. And we look to mass transit and we look to, the county for ways that we can address that. But right now, there's so few of our schools that are actually on mass transit line. It just doesn't, it's not always as attractive as an option as it could be. And so there's a lot of potential that's going untapped. But I hear your point that they could use it for their own individual needs, not just the transportation of school. So I appreciate that clarification.
Ms. Johnson Hospital?
Just a quick follow-up. I was trying to get Mr. Nieder's attention. And you may not have I don't expect you to have the answer with you. But while I was chair, and then I think you followed up as well a little, Jim. Do you have a sense of how many schools, there was a clear process for them to put more schools, more at least express buses near our schools? Do you know if they've made any headway? I've clearly not checked in the 3 years I haven't been chair. But I'm just curious if that's still a part of their process, because it speaks to providing a support and service to them in their everyday life. But then it also is helpful if we know, is there still a move to increase the number of schools that would have access?
I think there's a definite move. I think they've got a plan right now for 17 more schools to be put on this next plan within the next maybe less than a year. But that is an intent, I know. They know we want that. They know that.
So if I could make a suggestion, perhaps, I've had a couple of conversations with Ms. Cash about this and sent some information to chiefs to review. I think that, Ms. Kushner also said, I think when we were talking about employee benefits, do we know if the benefits we're giving them are the ones they want, or are there others that they might want? So I think it might be helpful to and I think we could do this fairly quickly, check with our employees to see the extent to which how many would want to have access to a Go Pass. And that would help us then determine how we might want to move forward with providing it as a benefit. Or, I even thought about, do we need to look at options, like every employee gets something from column A, B, or C. Which one do you want? Something along those lines. But those are just the thoughts that I have right now. And that would be helpful to find out from staff what they would be interested in, and then we apply a little bit more targeted support towards that. I do think we could do that fairly quickly, but I'd prefer to do that rather than add it as to the current superintendent's proposed budget. But of course, it's the board's budget, so you can do as you wish. But I wanted to propose that sort of as an alternative, and that we would then identify the source of funds for whatever we expanded in that benefit to employees sort of package.
Dr. Martin?
So on this particular issue, and I'm supportive of the idea, but I think, sort of to your point, Superintendent Moore, is I think it'd be wise, and to Ms. Kushner's earlier point, for us to just have a study, a documentation of all employee benefits. Potentially the menu that you talk of makes a lot of sense. It feels to me like the dollars for the Go Pass or anything else are ones that would legitimately be taken from some of the savings that we talked about that we're expecting to have that could go into fund balance, potentially, rather than necessarily incorporating into this year's budget. But I think we as a board could say that pending a review of the benefits, we would like to see some of those expected savings, which sound like they're going to be several $1 million, instead of just going into the fund balance, that some would be used for this purpose. Related to that, and I guess to these two options that you've proposed, Mr. Nieder, I don't know where my colleagues stand. I'm very supportive of both strategies. I see no reason not to do for sure to do the $10 million for the deferred operations, because that is using one-time federal funds, and anything we do to facilities and operations, well, I would like to see that be ongoing dollars. I also am a realist and know that that may not be ongoing dollars, but anything we do to facilities and operations improves the situation one time. So I feel like at a minimum, we should put that budget line in. I think that would be a wise use of federal dollars. Like I said, I'd love to see the increased commitment to our non-certified staff. My only concern about that is a concern I've raised before, and that is it's one-time dollars and we need continuing dollars for our non-certified staff. So this is where I really would like to challenge our colleagues on the commission to actually commit to this, right, potentially, and I don't know how we would get that commitment. But I could even see using the one-time federal dollars this year, but I need a commitment that that's going to be ongoing dollars. So I would love to see both these ideas incorporated. The facilities and operation, I see no reason not to include into this year's budget. The dealing with the non-certified staff, that's where I have concern because of the ongoing nature of it.
Mrs. Kushner.
Thank you, Chair Sutton. And I support the two recommendations that the adjustments that Mr. Nieder has sent to us. And I also do think we need to do a full review of benefits for our staff so that we can, see if this is something that fits. It probably would be available to us to adjust it by the end of June if we need to, since it doesn't seem like it would need to be a part of our local county ask. But I think it's important for us just to do that review of benefits. And I think it's also important for us to recognize that the state has a responsibility to our non-certified staff that should come from the state level. I think our local county commissioners have been great partners in helping us with our budget, but we keep slipping further and further behind as a district at the state level at the same time as the School Board Association points out in their legislative agenda. The state continues to put unanticipated costs on our school system without providing the resources that are needed. We saw that during this last year. I think it's important for this school board to join with other school boards across the state to make a statement about the state fulfilling its obligations. And it's great to have Teacher Appreciation Week this week, but I think our teachers and our non-certified staff and our principal leaders and all of our central office staff deserve to have our board make a statement about the state responsibilities. I think our legislative agenda is a great statement, so I'm glad we're going to include that in this budget. I think that's a great idea that my colleagues have had. And I think perhaps we should together craft a statement that further clarifies our position that we think the state needs to come through with their responsibilities to fund our staff needs, to fund our post-COVID needs, and to make sure we come out of this crisis truly able to serve every child every day. I sent out some language. If that's not acceptable to colleagues today, I'm willing to try to make sure that we work on that in the next week or two to really be able to make a clear statement as the legislature comes back to town and to continue their work on a budget.
Mrs. Carter.
Thank you. Well, I guess to go first to the two items and adjustments, I would support both, and I do have concerns not only about the non-certified staff and the one-time use funding. There's other pieces of our budget where we are doing the exact same thing. And so down the line, we're looking at possibly needing significant amount more from somewhere. So that is a concern, I think, not just for this area, but multiple areas if you look at the budget. So I just wanted to voice that concern. And I know I've been a stickler, Mr. Nieder, but really about the non-certified staff, but trying to get an idea because so many wonder what this means for them. So I do appreciate and I understand the process, but just, trying to advocate and so that they sitting here listening, or probably not right now, many of them are still working, but later on going, well, what does that mean for me? So, and if any watch the county commissioner last night, they're talking about a livable wage of $17.33. And you have many of our, grade 16, 18, making $11 an hour. So, it's very hard, for, to hear that last night from one group and then here we're sitting here, well, we don't know what it will mean. We have a lot of moving pieces. Get that, respect that. But I just want to voice my support and thank you for, continuing to address the multiple questions. And then kind of going to the resolution, I'm just going to be honest, been hit.
What
Yeah.
resolution are you speaking of?
That Ms. Kushner just mentioned? Board, right? She just mentioned?
She just talked about working on some language for a statement in the coming weeks. I didn't hear her mention the resolution.
Well, there was an email sent, and said it was a resolution, so
I did send language that was in a resolution, so is that
Yeah.
what you're referring to? And just as, and so I'll did send that email, yes.
Yeah. And so I
Okay,
guess.
Go ahead, Ms. Carter.
Yeah, sorry. Does that clarify?
Go ahead.
Okay. All right. So I guess for me, I think, our budget speaks volumes, and our legislative agenda or priorities that we have printed out. I guess for me, it addresses several issues such as the pay and such as responsibility. I guess my concern is, I know I've been asked several times by a group to form a resolution, and I am concerned because some of the wording reflects some of the very wording that I've been sent. So I'm just, in all transparency, that's where I'm coming from. I think we as a board have, that's my opinion with the legislative agenda or priorities and the budget here. So I don't guess I see the need in that those kind of speak for that, if that makes sense.
Mrs. Cash?
No. Wanted to ask if I could, Ms. Carter, do you support doing some sort of statement that would underscore the state's responsibility, to your very point of the non-certified staff and other places where we are using one-time money? I think we're doing that because in a crisis of a pandemic, as well as in the last 10 to 20 years, the state has not maintained the central funding for public education, not only in Wake County, and I think that's where the wording from the teachers that sent me that the wording that I lifted, because I think it hit the point of a statewide response, not just a Wake County response. But I think we need to join, and perhaps if the School Board Association language is more acceptable to staff and to pull out, they didn't have a resolution per se, but the School Board Association has a legislative agenda that touches on a lot of the same issues. And maybe if I can go back and formulate a resolution that picks up that language around state responsibilities for public education in North Carolina that doesn't privatize our schools, that doesn't spend tax dollars in a lack of transparent manner, for example, with some of the privatization movements, that we use state dollars for state public schools that serve all children, not just in Wake County, but all counties. So I'm sorry that's a long response, but would you support something along those lines that talks about a state responsibility and is original language that I'm happy to work with School Board Association language or other language that I'm happy to work with you on it, that would serve a Wake County and a state school board purpose to getting more state funding?
Well, I guess for me, that would be where our legislative agenda would have, or priorities would have come into play. I guess do you typically do both and make a separate resolution after you've set legislative agendas? Because I guess that's where I'm coming from. I feel like, and that's...
It's one board member saying,
Yeah.
I would like for us to do
Right.
both. So, I don't think that's what, I'm saying I would like for us to do both this year. Yeah. But I'm one board member.
Well, it would have, our legislative agenda, I guess I just keep going back to that and what our priorities are as the board. Even some of them were made before I got here, which is fine. That's kind of where I'm coming from. I don't know where everyone else is standing, but, I don't know.
Mr. Haggerty?
And again, I know this gets a little bit away from the discussion that Mr. Nieder and his staff have presented to us, but it's a healthy debate, and so I want to comment on it. I mean, I do think that these are important issues, and a lot of them are captured in our legislative agenda. What's a little bit different this year than in some past years is the district has historically relied on staff, either contract staff or employees, who can go out and advocate for the school system. And unless the superintendent has anything that new to share, we don't have anyone really like lobbying for Wake County schools right now, as has happened in the past. So we don't have a lot of active communications ongoing right now with the legislature, whereas before we could give the lobbyist for the schools our legislative agenda, and they could take it around, they could attend delegation meetings, they could really talk about those priority issues. We're not doing as much of that right now. So the idea that there's more vehicles we could use to try to get their attention and get in front of them, I think that has value. I do think, Ms. Carter, you do have a good point about, resolutions or resolutions from outside sources. And you see some school boards around the country that are commenting on human rights violations and, faraway countries or things like that. And I don't think we want to go, get into that move. But, this is something Ms. Kushner has said that, rather than just the draft that she presented, that we could come together and maybe craft something new. Following up on that idea, and I don't know if the timing works out, it might be something we may want to work with our county commissioners on and do something jointly. Because as I see it, what happens and what's been going on for 10 years in this state is that the state legislature, by not fully funding education, reduces their budget, reduces the taxes they charge, but then pushes those same legitimate expenses down to local governments. In that case, our county commission. And so our county commissions around the state are left to make up education shortfalls. And, that's a drain on their revenues, their ability to provide services, and it's a burden to the property taxpayers of our county and others. So the idea of fully funding education, whatever we as a board think that means, maybe it's something that we could talk about either to the county commissioners at a joint meeting, or maybe we could sort of like show more of a United Wake County. It might even be that we have some municipal leaders that want to sign on behind it. But just more that we can do to advocate for effective and just basic school funding, I think is important. The Supreme Court of this state has been saying for over 10 years that the state's failed its constitutional responsibility to fully fund our schools. And whether, I don't think there's any bad time to keep reminding them of that until such time as that can be remedied. So I do hear your concerns about, resolutions and external resolutions, and I think that's valid. But I think together we can work together and really say what I think a lot of us support, which is that we need more state money for our public schools.
Thank you, Mr. Hagerty. Mrs. Cash.
So I also support the two adjustments to our budget for $10 million each. And as much as I like studies, I don't. So this GoPass and the study for benefits, I have no problem with the study and that we find out what benefits say what, but I don't want to be talking about this 6 months from now and we haven't found out what I think Superintendent Moore knows we've had this discussion that I would prefer to find out as quickly as possible what benefits we can offer from this budget. Thanks.
Mrs. Scott.
Thank you. I'm also fully supportive of increasing those amounts to $10 million. And I was speaking briefly about this with Mr. Nieder before the meeting, but just a little concerned about our impact on CNS, particularly in a year where they did not have the additional revenue streams coming in with being able to sell additional food items. And then just moving forward, understanding that our local dollars do step in to help supplement when we do have a district-wide pay increase, which again, I fully support for everyone, but just understanding that their budget operates a little differently with the enterprise. So I'm just was wondering, Mr. Nieder, if you might be able to speak a little bit about that and how we can keep an eye on that moving forward without necessarily having to ask for families to bear that burden with increased meal prices down the road, anytime soon.
Yes, Ms. Scott, certainly I'll share, and I'm going to share some of the conversation. An enterprise fund, generally speaking, the revenues it generates covers the expenditures it must make to operate. A bit of an oversimplification, but more or less the essence. This year, we have supplemented that because the operations have not been normal, both through closure and through the virtual academy. Thus, about 50% of the potential customers of the operation, even now that we're all back in, are not there, has impacted. You've heard in previous presentations, we've used CARES funding to supplement the CNS operation. We've used local funding to supplement it. As I also shared with Ms. Scott, we haven't really been open in Virtual Academy full-time until April 8th. So we will, by the end of June, have a sense of what revenues look like, albeit with the Virtual Academy. We'll have a sense of projecting what next year may look like, because assuming we're going to continue as a normal operation next year, with the one distinction of having a Virtual Academy, but we'll know within a few weeks how many students will be in Virtual Academy, we'll be able to tell to what degree they may run at a deficit, and we'll be able to determine how we supplement that funding along with all the other budget adjustments we've talked about. So getting to the point, though, of a non-certified increase under normal conditions, an enterprise fund pays its salaries. And if we say we're going to increase those salaries, in this case non-certified staff, that would put an additional load on the enterprise funds. So that would mean, and I'm not recommending this, I'm not even proposing it, one way to do it is to generate more money is to raise prices. Another way to do it is to supplement it with other sources of funding. So, as I shared with Ms. Scott, unless it is just prohibitive, whatever type of change is recommended and finally approved by the board for non-certified staff, I'd like to think we'll find a way to assist CNS in implementing that. Certainly not going to hold them out separate from the rest of our non-certified staff. Did that provide, Ms. Scott, what you're looking for?
It did very much,
Okay.
and I appreciate that explanation. And I just hope we could, as we do move forward, if you could provide that number as you update us with the information, if that could just be sure to include that in the information, I'd appreciate it so much.
We will.
Thank you. And then I did just want to say to Ms. Kushner, if I'm hearing you, I also think that you're asking, our collective role as elected officials for a board of education, public education, is to sometimes make a stance that yes, we support our state funding our public schools, and that sometimes it is appropriate to go above and beyond that. So that's what I was hearing you say, and I just wanted to extend that I certainly support that.
Ms. Johnson-Hostler.
Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Nieder. One other follow-up, and I'm glad you had already talked about CNS, and I know we have this conversation every year, so just bear with me that you have to give me another answer. So back to CNS, are we, or do you know, and you can come back and tell us, because you used the word deficit, but it didn't sound certain, do you believe or anticipate that we're going to have a deficit in the enterprise fund, or will it be flat because we had federal funds supplementing while we were feeding?
For the current year?
For
next year?
Yes.
I won't anticipate it. They will not ultimately run at a deficit because we will have to, if they are within the enterprise fund, we'll have to find a way to supplement it with outside revenues or funding.
So when you refer to a deficit, tell me what you were referencing then.
Revenues, CNS revenues minus CNS expenditures.
Which is a deficit.
CNS revenues, let me put it differently. CNS revenues generated from meal sales and federal reimbursements minus CNS operating expenditures. They were at a deficit. If you took those two numbers for the current year, that was a deficit. What made it net out to zero was the local money we put in and the CARES funding. So as far as next year, I'm going to look at Mr. Winters. I'm not sure I would project whether or not they will need supplemental funding or not. One of the things I'd want to know first is, what does it look like virtual academy? What are those numbers? Because obviously for the current year, it was significant, about half the student population.
Okay, and so my follow-up to that is, again, to your point, thank you. I thought you were projecting to next year, so thank you for clarifying. So even if we're not projecting to next year, we know that we're still going to, I mean, now the American Rescue Plan Act has been extended to 2026. So I guess my question is still, at this point, from what you've seen from the funding that I'm looking at, all three of you at this point, for what you've seen that will come for CNS funds out of the ARPA Act, is there not an anticipation that that will be supplementing even in the, again, I'm to Ms. Scott's point, I'm trying to figure out how we don't pass on an increase, given we do know that we are going to be anticipating federal funding supplemental through American Recovery Rescue Act.
Yes, and I guess to the point, regardless of funding, we understand, because they're the very staff that we depend on as well to meet our responsibilities within the district, that we need to do something for them. So in a very general way, I would say, whether it's one or a combination of funding sources, the one-time federal funding, which in an ideal situation would not be used for recurring expenditures, but has been pointed out today, we are doing that during this time, or current year savings, which again are not recurring, or some other reduction in order to do a non-certified increase. I do not believe that the CNS operation should be the driver in what we do for our non-certified staff. I'd say we should come up with the available funding we have. And again, if you look at the CNS operation, in normal times, their revenue is $50-ish million. Is that right, Mr. Winters? About $50 million out of a $2 billion operating budget. So it's very important, but relatively speaking, we can find a way to make it work in all likelihood.
Thank you. I mean, again, so there are two things for me. One, of course, is not to pass on the cost to students. And the other piece is just to reiterate the comments that have already been made. I certainly will agree that it'd be great to have our own small work group to come up with language, but this furthers the example, the reason for me to have a resolution. Because again, while we have our own enterprise, the reality is it's great, we're Wake County, we have an enterprise, but at the end of the day, that some of that cost is being passed on to our students, and for me personally, in a time that we shouldn't be passing on any cost to any family when there are options for us to not do that. Now, I appreciate you breaking out the deficit for me, but again, my pushback is, yes, we should be saying to the state, who at this point, and certainly you all know, our state isn't in a deficit. And if there is ever a time to be asking our state to step up to their responsibilities for our children, it is now. Now, I will be transparent. You all know I'm a fan of resolutions. I think as a board, to not do resolutions shutters our voice, and I've said that since I've been on the board. Without having a full-time lobbyist, and we haven't since I've been on the board, a resolution is our conduit to telling people what we need and what we believe in. So I'm not a stickler for the language, but to say in a moment in time where there's a significant amount of money in our state budget that they're trying to figure out how to fund, and we're not going to fight for every dollar for our students, That's hard for me to swallow as a school board member. Now, if we were in a deficit, I might feel a little differently. But, one of the other things, and I don't remember if Ms. Kushner mentioned it, but when we look at our county government employees being up to 1733, Mr. Nieder can speak better than anyone because we had to walk through how do we build up our non-certified staff because the state didn't include us, right? More language we should be saying to the state. When the state increased salaries for hourly workers, they explicitly left out school system employees. So to not call those things into question, for me as a school board member, is irresponsible, especially in a time where our state can be taking those costs. So there's a number of reasons for me of whatever language we use or methodology, right? If the board doesn't agree to a resolution, then I certainly would say, then do we talk to the School Boards Association, who's been wonderful to us on our calendar, to say, is this something we can push a little harder? I'm open to options, but I do believe in this moment in time, because there is access to funding, that we should be asking for what we want. But thank you for answering all my questions so I could weave the path.
So are there any more comments about the budget? Dr. Martin.
Well, my comment was more to the discussion about resolution or statement or what.
Go ahead.
I want to support Mr. Haggerty's idea of potentially working together with the commissioners because I actually think that has a chance of being heard in a different way. But to a lot of the discussion that's gone around this, and again, I think Mr. Haggerty was right, the bigger question is what do we do with whatever it is once we have it, right? The legislative priorities, for example, have they been sent to legislators? It strikes me that we should have a cover letter in the absence of a lobbyist, which we don't have right now. But we at minimum need a cover letter that explains a lot of these things that we've just been talking about that goes with our legislative agenda to the legislators. I feel the same kind of thing would happen should we do a resolution. I don't want us to get into a situation where we have a legislative agenda or we pass resolutions and think, hey, we're done because we passed a resolution. That is a little bit talking to the wind. So whether we have a resolution or whether we don't have a resolution doesn't matter to me as much as what would we do with it. For me, the point isn't just to say, hey, teachers, hey, public, look, we made a statement. But I would like to see action. That's why I really like the idea of working with the commissioners to potentially try to find, because this is a joint need for both of us. But even with our legislative agenda, I think it's a step forward to incorporate into our budget document. That's a step in the right direction. But I think we really need a cover letter at minimum and have this legislative agenda with a lot of these very issues that we've just been talking about sent to, at a minimum, every member of the Wake delegation. But we're really talking about bigger state issues, so it probably should be to every member of the education committees in both the House and the Senate, and the Speaker of the House and the President Pro Tem of the Senate at a minimum. So I guess for me, I'm more interested in what do we do with these things than the formality of what it is. So just an additional perspective.
So two things. One, on the non-certified staff increase, and heard the concerns, and I think we as a board made it quite clear at our last meeting that we wanted to ensure that there was room in this budget for an increase for our non-certified employees. Staff heard that. Staff has responded to that, I think, in a very aggressive way, or in as an aggressive manner as we can do at this point, given that we still have to wait to see what both the county and the state does. That is in this budget. I think the position of staff and this board is quite clear, but if we're looking for a specific figure or dollar amount, it's not there yet, and we won't see it until, again, the local budget is in place and the state budget is in place. So to those that are listening, our non-certified staff, I think you hear the cavalry coming, but if it is difficult at this point to say exactly when, or here's a date, or here's a dollar amount. But you do have the commitment, I think, of this board, and it will be reflected in this budget, that we will see that increase. Staff has heard that, and we are supportive of that. With regard to what I'm hearing, be it a resolution, be it a cover letter, a statement, I am in support of language that you're talking about, Ms. Kushner, that supports the need of the state. Obviously, we are a ways away from crafting what that language will look like. I do think that there is value in working with our partners, particularly the School Board Association, county commissioners, and others, to create some comprehensive and thoughtful language that can be used in a number of places. I think we have started with our legislative agenda. That can be used as a cover letter to send with that to legislators. That can be used as a statement by this board, and in other places. I don't see sort of each time there's a need, we're crafting another statement or another other additional language. But I think if we work and take some time to create something that's thoughtful and comprehensive, it can be used in multiple places. So if there are board members who are interested in working on that language, Mrs. Kushner has offered to lead that effort. Those that want to work with her on crafting a statement, I think we can certainly get the help and support of staff in that. And there's additional information I think we can get from the School Board Association, from county commissioners, and others, including the Justice Center and others who have also been working on information around Leandro and the push for more funding through Leandro as well. So there is, I think, an opportunity to do that. Perhaps it's not tonight, perhaps it's not this week. And I know it's Teacher Appreciation Week, and that would be nice to show that this week. But I think this is more a larger effort that would include, again, county commissioners, the school board associations all around the state, and others to really, I think, as you and Ms. Kushner and Ms. Johnson-Hostler have articulated, an opportunity for us to really kind of put a stake in the ground and say that we need to provide more funding to public education. The state has a responsibility to do so, along with local boards, local commissions, and we can do that in a broader, I think, statement, language, whatever you want to call it. So we'll work on that and find the perfect time to do that. Any questions, again, around the budget before we move on and we make our next move in the next meeting for this to become the board's budget? Mr. Nieder, I'll see you.
I was
rising.
just, Mr. Sutton, as you were just saying, I just wanted to confirm with the board what I believe I've heard, but that the board is ready in your board meeting this evening to consider approval of the board proposed budget. And I heard a general sense that the board was supportive of those two adjustments for the maintenance and operations, as well as for the non-certified. And that was asked sort of as a question.
And will we need amendments to the budget along these two adjustments, for these two adjustments?
We will not need amendments. The two adjustments do not change the amount of county appropriation that is being requested at all, neither one of them. The actual budget document will be adjusted to reflect the changes. And the source for both cases, it's federal funding is the ultimate source of both those adjustments. So your document will, your board's approved budget will have a change. But as far as the amount of county appropriation being requested, that does not change from what's in the current proposed budget.
I still think it might be, for clarity's sake, good to just to make that clear tonight when we vote on the budget.
Well, I will be pointing that out.
Okay, thank you.
And we will include
Just to be clear.
the write-up on the two adjustments as backup documentation as well.
Thank you, Mr. Nieder.
Yes.
And thank you, Mr. Sutton, for your summary. I think your summary of where we should go next as a statement and as a coalition around and bringing in other partners, I think is a great way to go. So, and it could, because I think as you've pointed out before, we're the largest school district in North Carolina, and this is a place where we can and should take a lead. So thank you for that suggestion. I totally agree.
Mr. Chair, might I recommend that you consider incorporating some of this language in your budget letter, because I think you can make that kind of a statement on behalf of the board that becomes part of this document. And I think there would be from what I'm hearing, there'd be general support.
What would the statement be again?
Well, the chair always writes a letter about the budget. And it just strikes me that incorporating some of the idea of the need for the state to pick up some lifts, like the non-certified staff, like the counselors, social workers, nurses, et cetera, would be appropriate to incorporate into that letter.
I think the point of the statement is that, in this time where we are seeing additional revenues on the state level, we've seen historical cuts over the years to public education that have affected salaries, particularly for non-certified, but all public education employees particularly, that this is a time where we would like to see the state step up and perhaps provide some additional funding. So I think that's a general sense or tenor of the statement and what it would look like. Ms. Carter.
And I just want to circle back because I feel like several comments have been kind of directed at what I said, and I just want to clarify. My statement is nothing about not asking the state to pull their weight. My statement is that we, the board, are setting our priorities separate from any external organization sending emails requesting we do so. So that was my concern, and I want to make that very clear. And I think I've kind of been clear throughout the budget process on several of my things that I've been very vocal about. So, but that's all I wanted to do because I do feel like several things were not clear. Thank you.
All right. Anything else, Mr. Nita? Did you need anything else? Are you okay? Ms. Scott, were you about?
No, I was looking at you.
Oh, okay. All right. All right, then with that, we'll move on. The next item is an update on compensation incentives for certified staff to support school extension, learning, and recovery. Dr. Matillo, you're leading us on this one.
Yes, sir. Chair Sutton, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, members of the board, Superintendent Moore as well. I also have with me Dr. Marcy Holland, Senior Director for Talent Management, who will be available to help participate in any discussion and questions. So thank you for the opportunity to share some brief updates regarding compensation recommendations for certified summer learning staff. We'd like to gather your feedback before we bring this back to you as an action item for approval at your May 18th meeting. We are still working on a compensation package for support staff that acknowledges their vital contributions to the summer learning program and considers both hourly rates and additional incentive pay, and plan to bring those recommendations as well to you at the May 18th meeting. We'll start with salary recommendations for certified staff members. During last week's Student Achievement Committee, staff shared a potential rate of $40 per hour for certified staff who choose to work in our summer learning program. We have since increased our recommendation to $45 an hour for certified staff. Increasing this rate to $45 better aligns with our highest paid teachers, those with master's degrees and national boards who have 18 to 20 or more years of experience. The current employees in 10 or 11 month positions who aren't employed during that summer learning time would be eligible. And retired staff members may be an asset here also and would be eligible for this rate. Internal and external candidates would be considered, although we do anticipate it would be mostly internal candidates that might be interested. Certified staff members may work up to 40 hours per week in the summer learning program. As outlined in HB 82, teachers who have received previous performance bonuses for reading and math or hold national board certification are eligible to receive a legislated signing bonus of $1,200. Additionally, third grade reading teachers are eligible to receive $150 per student who enters the program not demonstrating proficiency, who then becomes proficient after completing the program. In addition to the legislated signing bonuses for certain staff members, the district recommends an additional $1,200 attendance bonus for all certified and support staff who commit to the full 6-week program. The local bonus helps us acknowledge all of our certified and support staff who are willing to commit to this program. The bonus will be prorated at $400 for staff who are able to work 3 weeks of the program. We believe this way of prorating the additional district bonus, where the employee receives $400 for working a 3-week session and then receives an additional $800 for working the entire 6-week session, kind of strikes that balance between recognizing all employees who make that commitment, but also realizing the really large ask we're asking of employees who commit to the full 6 weeks. The bonus would be prorated at $400 for every 2-week session worked at year-round sites. We will bring final recommendations for board approval to your May 18th board meeting. These recommendations will include the compensation plan for certified staff we're presenting today, pending your feedback, of course, as well as a plan for support staff compensation. This last slide here just provides an outline of some of the next steps in our staffing timeline. We will begin monitoring student enrollment numbers and will assign staff positions with these numbers. We'll align staff positions with these numbers, and the hiring process will look very similar to what our regular hiring process looks like, as all positions will be posted in AppleTrack to advertise, and school administrators at the sites will lead the hiring process and submit recommendations to HR. That concludes the presentation. Happy to take questions and discussion at this time.
Ms. Mahaffey.
Thank you, Chair Sutton. Dr. Matillo, on slide 3, where it talks about the signing bonus, the legislated signing bonus of $1,200.
Correct.
When they say prior recipient, does that just mean in a previous year or just the previous year when that was offered?
I think it's in any of the previous years, correct? Yes, any
Okay.
of the previous years.
And then on the next slide, for the third grade reading bonus, it's a little concerning to me that we're, for every kid that gets proficient, the teacher gets an amount, but I'm assuming based on the title of legislative performing bonus, that was a state decision?
Correct. Yeah, those first two slides there are the state legislated that we have no flexibility in, and that's why we wanted to do something a bit more differentiated with the district bonus.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
And then we will be hearing more about the non-certified staff pay at a future meeting?
Correct. That we'll bring back at May 18th, probably at your work session for discussion before asking for your consideration and approval during the actual board meeting.
Okay, and that would also include, I'm assuming we'll be providing lunches, breakfast, and we'll need custodians on campus as well.
Right.
And is there any compensation for administrators? I know our administrators are 12-month employees, but this is additional on top of all duties as assigned. Is there?
Yeah, I think we're looking to do something with assistant principal support for the program, and that's
Okay.
one of the reasons, although administrators are certified, that it's taking us a little bit longer to work through some of those non-certified positions because there's so many different employee groups that we're trying to look at and make sure we're making good decisions by.
Right, because our assistant principals are generally 10 months? Or
They have a contract for 10 months, but they can be up to 12 months. So many of them are, some of them are 11 months, so it varies by school and level.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yes, ma'am.
Mrs. Kushner.
Thank you, Chair Sutton. And Dr. Matillo, I appreciate that y'all are going to try to look at enrollment. Do you have any sense of enrollment for students outside the Wake County school system? It's my understanding the state has, say if there's a low-performing child from a charter school, those charter schools aren't doing the summer learning, but we are obligated to serve those children as well. Are there other children outside the Wake County public school system that we're obligated to include in this program?
Yeah, I don't have a sense of those obligations. Another team is working on that, but I do know we've just sent our notices out to our families, so we don't have any sense right now of what our student numbers look like.
Because we can
for the
all
summer.
communicate with our families. We're not, is that I suppose that's an unknown from another state mandate. I don't know if others on your team,
I'm
Superintendent
not
Moore.
I'm not sure if there's anyone online that has the answer to that question, but I don't think I read it initially as obligated, but rather if there is space that we make available.
So we can still prioritize students that impacted in Wake County Public
We'll
Schools.
verify and
Okay.
make sure.
Thank you.
Mrs. Scott?
Thank you. And just to add to Ms. Mahavy's questions on slide 3, do they have to be, for national board certified, is that any subject, they're just a national board certified teacher regardless of the area to
Yes.
receive that
Yes, ma'am.
bonus? Thank you. And student enrollment will be, and I apologize for not asking this question last week, but student enrollment closes on the 14th, but that's prior to EOG testing. But they'll be taking the EOGs again at the beginning of the summer school. Is that kind of a back-to-back thing? And I realize this is not, this doesn't have to do necessarily with staffing, but I was also just thinking the number of students who might be recommended if their EOG suggests, if it was something extraordinarily low, that might put up a red flag that had not been there before. So I was just wondering how that would work, because that could potentially require additional staff.
Ms. Scott, this is Brian Pittman. I can try to answer that for you. Our students, while the May 14th date is a deadline for students to be enrolled, it is a deadline for us to try to finalize rosters for the purpose of coordinating transportation routes, coordinating with CNS, determining additional staff to allot to sites so that we support the student need. Schools can add additional students after that based on need. So we wouldn't necessarily exclude a student if a school identified a need after the May the 14th. We're just trying to get all the logistics in place to support a smooth operation. To your question of the EOGs, while we do in K-8 have a requirement to do a pre-test and post-test, we aren't necessarily obligated to administer the EOG again, and that's not really our plan. In many cases, for our elementary students in particular, we'll have the ability to use, for example, end-of-year iStation assessment so that we already have that benchmark for the beginning of the summer, and we can minimize assessment and try to maximize instruction and learning during that time that we have students in the summer.
And thank you for that, Mr. Pittman. And just a quick follow-up question to that. Does that provide the data needed for a staff member potentially receiving that $150 bonus, or is that specifically to EOG?
So I'm going to have to follow up on that question, Ms. Scott, and I'm happy to provide an answer.
When you said that iStation data could potentially provide whether or not growth has occurred, at least I think that's what you were explaining for younger students. But on
Yes, ma'am, that's my understanding, but I want to verify that in relationship to the $150 bonus that Dr. Mutillo has mentioned, and I'm happy to follow up on that.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you.
Ms. Carter?
I just had a follow-up. I know, before when y'all came, you had talked about not all schools, particularly elementary schools, won't have a site. There'll be some that are regional. And I was just trying to see if there was, I think before it was mentioned, towards middle of May or so, communication could be sent to staff more about the specifics, because many have already started applying for summer jobs. And, we're kind of looking for, one, to see if they would have it at their school, what the dates or hours would be. So is there a closer timeline now? Is there a date out there? Do you know that will be released to staff just so they can start planning?
Yeah, Mr. Pittman, do you have an answer to that?
Yes, sir. I can try to answer that. Ms. Carter, it's a great question. In short, schools have now received, all of our schools, principals and the site-based coordinators have now received the dates for their programs, as well as some information about base allotment so they can start talking with staff at their school over the last week or week and a half about those topics. We anticipate that the positions themselves could be posted as early as later this week so that we can more fully communicate with staff beyond just principals communicating, but a district communication to staff, particularly now that we have shared in Dr. Mutillo's presentation more details about the compensation, which of course would be one of the key questions that staff would have. So I would anticipate within the next few days additional communication going out to all staff related to that through postings and other communication.
All right, thank you.
Ms. Mahaffey?
Thank you. Dr. Mutillo, just one follow-up on the national board certification. If someone is no longer in the classroom, left to be an instructional coach, but still has their certification, would that bonus apply to them?
I would say it would, right, if they had it? Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. Yeah, it still would.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
So, Dr. Mutillo, I'm looking at, so the slides, I guess 3, the 2 that say legislative performance bonus, those don't require approval from the board since they're already legislatively mandated. Am I correct?
I don't think they require approval, but we generally do bring those to you when it has a salary impact. But I don't know that we officially ask for approval. Jonathan, can you support on that one?
My take would be that one of them indicates with funds available. With available funds, you'll pay the $1,200 signing bonus. So I do think that it would be helpful to have board approval on that since you're essentially saying that we would have the funds for it.
So all of this, though, because I see then there's the district-approved district attendance bonus, which obviously would require our approval. And then I'm assuming the second slide that has the salary recommendations.
Correct.
Requires our approval.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And student enrollment, you have on the 14th, and we meet on the 18th. So then does that give you all enough sort of flexibility? And I guess I'm thinking about 2 incentives that would empower you all to get funds and compensation into teachers' hands as quickly as possible. So I'm thinking about particularly the signing bonus, and then I see one where it's prorated every 3 weeks. Would that still be then, they would get half of that at the end of the month's paycheck and the next month's paycheck? Is there something we could do to maybe get it over the summer and pay every 2 weeks instead of a month? Would that mess up the payroll schedule or system? I'm just thinking about, again, how we can get, if we're trying to incentivize teachers, how we can get money into the hands of, compensation to the hands of teachers as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I think we're still working with comp services to get all of those details hammered. I think our initial thoughts are for something like a signing bonus, we would try to pay that with like a July payroll, and then some of the incentive pay would come a little bit later after that, but we're still working through some of those details. But it is definitely in our mind that with a signing bonus, you do want to look to try to get that in teachers' hands as quickly as possible, or support staff's hands.
The signing bonus would probably, if it's going to be split, that one will come first. But obviously, the attendance for being there all 6 weeks, or the performance, 150 per student, will have to come after.
Right. Okay. Just thinking ahead, sort of the next meeting and what you would need from us to make sure you've got all the tools that you need to have as robust of a summer program as possible.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And between now and then, obviously, we will continue to work through a lot of the details around specifics of when compensation might occur so we can communicate that to our teachers as well.
Okay.
And if I could just provide a couple of points of clarification directly out of the statute. The assessment, the performance bonus for the $150 per student for the assessment is tagged to the alternate assessment that is provided by DPI. So it's not necessarily the EOG. And the statute is not specific, as it encourages charter schools to have a summer program, does not require them. And the only language is not specific, says once we have offered it to our priority students, we can offer it to other students, but we must prioritize the students who have demonstrated need. And it doesn't say who other students are.
How does it define priority?
We've established as a district what our priorities are for who we invite. And so those are the students that must be the priority. So if for some reason we found ourselves just enough teachers, just enough students based on the invitations that we offered and the teachers that have told us they want to work, that we feel like we don't have space, then we wouldn't offer any additional slots. But if we felt like we did have enough space, then we could, and we'd have to have a method for prioritizing those.
Thank you, Ms. Moore. That's helpful. Thank you, Chair Sutton.
All right. Any other questions from the board? Dr. Matillo, anything else?
No, sir. Thank you, Chair Sutton. Thank you,
All right.
members of the board.
Thank you. All right, our next item is an overview of spring end of grade and end of course testing. Dr. McMillan. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, Chair Sutton, Superintendent Moore, members of the board. I'm here today to give you a high-level overview of sort of how we're handling the end of grade and the end of course testing that we are required to do here this spring under these most unusual of circumstances. And so I'm just going to hit the highlights of a few things that are happening this year that might be a little bit different from how they were happening pre-pandemic, and then leave some time at the end for any questions or clarifications that you all might require. Testing is being required for just about every state this year by the U.S. Department of Education under ESSA. The District of Columbia is the only location that has gotten permission to not test this year. All of the other states generally are. Within that, though, there are some flexibilities that the U.S. Department of Education has granted us, specifically related to the implications of those tests, or on the accountability side of the ledger, not necessarily the testing side. While they are requiring us to give the end of grade and end of course tests that federal legislation requires, there are flexibilities such as some flexibility around the rule that we have to test 95% of all of our students in every grade and every subgroup in every school, knowing full well that that's going to be very difficult for states this year. Also, the federal program that identifies schools for comprehensive or targeted support, that program is essentially being frozen, so any schools that are in those categories and eligible for those services will remain so for one more year. No more schools will be identified, and no schools will be unidentified and removed from that status, at least for the next year, for example. However, the administration of tests is not part of that waiver. Within that, DPI has requested all of the flexibilities that they could from the U.S. Department of Ed, given what they are allowing states to do. They have also relaxed some of the logistical requirements, and a couple of those are mentioned here. You may recall that in state law, schools are required to give all end-of-grade tests within the last 10 days of the school year, and all end-of-course tests for semester-long courses within the last 5 days. The DPI has been granting waivers to that on an as-needed basis for any schools who need to extend that window a little farther in order to make testing work in a safe way for their students this year, and we have schools that are taking advantage of that on a case-by-case basis. They have also relaxed some of the rules around having to administer assessments online. Over the last several years, DPI has been moving more and more toward online administration of end-of-grade and end-of-course assessments, but this year, because of so many schools operating or districts operating virtual academies and having a lot of those school-provided devices in those homes with those students, some schools don't have enough devices now left at the school to operate online testing, and so some of them are requesting waivers from that, and DPI is also being very generous about granting those for schools that need them, so they can go back to the paper and pencil form of the test to make sure that they can do that in an efficient way. However, of course, we are still required to test all students, and not only that, DPI is requesting that all districts test all students in person in school. There is no platform that they have available to them to take a test like an end-of-grade test or an end-of-course test and deliver it in a secure fashion to a student in their home and ensure that they can maintain the test security that they're required to maintain on those tests. So that is sort of one thing that we cannot get around, and that's something we dealt with in the fall. We'll deal with it here again in the spring. End of course, and also career and technical education tests, which are largely at the high school level and a little bit also at the middle school level, by state board policy have to count for 20% at least of a student's final grade, according to our policy as well. And just like we did in the fall, we will be operationalizing that policy by only factoring in that test score into the student's grade in the case where it helps the student. So what I mean by that is, if a student's going into the final, if you will, and has a certain grade, say an 86, going into the final in a English 2, when they take the English 2 assessment, if that score results in a number going into the grade book that would lower that student's grade below an 86, then the student will earn an 86 as their final grade for the semester. So it's sort of a hold harmless thing where you can only help yourself with that assessment. It cannot actually cause your grade to drop. This is something we did in the fall, and we talked to you all a little bit about this in October when we brought this decision to you. The main reason here being we know that in a lot of courses, particularly CTE courses, to some degree also biology, with students going to school remotely for a good portion of the year this year, even those students who were in Plan A, B, C, we know that some of the standards that students are going to be required to be measured on those tests were very difficult for teachers to teach and students to learn in a remote environment. And so in order to be fair to those students, we put that in place in the fall, and we will be carrying that over into the spring as well. A, for that same reason, and B, because we don't want to have a different measuring stick for students here in the spring than we had in the fall and create an unlevel playing field for students who happen to take the test in one semester or another. Perhaps the biggest complication with operationalizing things here this spring has to do with our virtual academy students and with that requirement that they have to come onto campus in order to take end of grade or end of course tests. We work closely with the transportation department to make sure that yellow bus transportation is available for all students who will be coming in to test on those days that the school is setting aside for testing, even though they may not have been there all year. And schools are being as flexible and accommodating as they can with families to make sure that they feel comfortable sending their student in for testing and that it's going to be a good experience and that they're comfortable with the health and safety procedures that we have in place for that. However, the offer of virtual academy students to come in to test, we are not requiring them to. We are allowing families to make that choice. We want to make sure that if they are not comfortable sending their child to school for health reasons, which is why maybe they're in virtual academy to begin with, that we are not penalizing the student for choosing not to come in on that one day to take that one test when they haven't been in school all year. Now, with the tests for which there are grading implications, those EOCs and CTE tests that I mentioned earlier, we're going to have the same process for them that we have for the face-to-face students in terms of the hold harmless. But in addition, for VA students who do not come in to take those tests because they or their families feel like it's not an appropriate health choice for them, they will basically have their final grade for those courses determined based on the grade they have going into the course. So the quarterly averages that they would have had, say, in quarter 3 or quarter 4. So again, the same treatment to both sets of students, whether they are face-to-face or potentially coming in from virtual academy. With respect to the end of grade tests, we don't really have that consideration because there are no grading implications for a student in terms of how they score on an end of grade test. It does not affect their course average or any kind of GPA or anything like that. So that's a non-issue in terms of how it affects the grade. And then lastly, we've got a few other things we're sort of keeping an eye on as we go here, as schools are prepping for doing this. Right now, they're in the middle of contacting virtual academy families and essentially asking them whether they will be planning on bringing their child in so that we can establish bus routes so that schools can know how much materials to order, set up all the different rooms they need to set up and know how many administrators that they need, et cetera, et cetera. But there are some other things that are a little bit unknown in terms of the implications of the scores down the road, whatever scores we obtain from our students this spring, and a few of those are kind of outlined here on this last slide. At the third grade level, we know that the Read to Achieve process in terms of students meeting that legislative standard is somewhat dependent on the end of grade, third grade test. While that is not the only way that students can meet the Read to Achieve standard, it is a way. And if we do have some third grade, say, virtual academy students who, for whatever reason, choose not to come in to take that test, those determinations will then be made based on the other gateways that students have to demonstrate that standard, such as iStation or potentially an assessment the student might take in the fall when they come back to school and all the other different pathways that students can have to meet that standard. These middle three here refer to the state mandated components of our accountability system. They're federally mandated, but they're also written into state law, and that has to do with school performance grades. It has to do with EVOS growth results, and also the North Carolina's continually low performing school designations, which are, as you know, are also related to the legislation around restart schools and things like that. Given what the U.S. Department of Ed has told DPI, those things are part of the waiver that we have received from the U.S. Department of Ed. However, in order to actually be waived from those requirements, there's also state statutes that say that we have to do those things, and those state laws also have to change. So just because the federal government has waived those requirements, we can't necessarily assume that they will not be in place unless and until the state were to make changes to specific statutes. And we've got a couple of bills that are pending in the legislature, one on the Senate side, one on the House side. The one on the Senate side is the one that speaks most clearly to this. And basically what it would do, the Senate Bill 654, is to operationalize those flexibilities for 1 year due to the pandemic, should it pass. I believe it's up for second reading today in the Senate, so it would still have to pass the Senate and make crossover to the House, be signed by the governor, so that is pending. But we do have the flexibility from the U.S. Department of Education to waive those particular components if and when the state decides to make those modifications if they were to become law. With that was about all I had in terms of remarks today. I've got some other folks available. If there are any other questions that you all have that I can't answer, I may call on a couple of other people to answer some detailed questions, but what questions do you have?
I do want to state the importance of your last slide and the part that you just talked about, and even would maybe ask us to perhaps consider in the statement that we were talking about earlier about perhaps including something in language about testing. We've heard so many requests about, well, why aren't, or questions raised, I guess, about why aren't these end of year and of course tests being waived. And I think it's important, and many of the experts and professors around the country, Superintendent Moore and I have talked about this. We need testing. If for no other reason than to see and understand both the progress and the regression of students during the pandemic. But what we need to ensure that students and schools and teachers and principals are not penalized because of the impact of testing and performance. And I think that's an important statement that I think we ought to at least consider making and saying to the state and the General Assembly. I'm glad to see that there's legislation pending around this. I didn't think I had heard where there had actually a decision had actually been made, but I do think it's important that we essentially hold harmless for 1 year. Those that are affected by the low performance school designations, and others because they're so much impacted by the results of these tests, and we don't want to see students, again, principals, there's so much that's impacted by this, and we don't want to see that being harmed by the performance on these tests. So just something for us to consider that also might be a part of the statement that we talked about earlier. I know we don't want to perhaps muddy the water around funding and focusing on that, but I just think that this is a very important piece and one that I would ask us to at least maybe consider as a part of that. Mrs. Scott.
Thank you, Chair Sutton. And I don't know if we need testing, but we certainly need consistent metrics to help determine whether or not our students are experiencing growth and where need is. So I certainly understand what you're saying, but I do get a little nervous about that. So I just wanted to, that can be a healthy debate another time.
Absolutely, yeah. And maybe need is a strong word, but I think having that measure or metric of
absolutely. I mean,
seeing where the progression and regression has occurred is important.
100%. And we know there is need out there. We know this year has had quite an impact on many of us, and we see that continuing on and on in so many different ways. I did want to say I appreciate the information about the iStation, again, being a different alternative to measure student reading. But again, I think I asked this back in January, third grade students, many third grade students, especially those who may have been virtual, had the option to not take the beginning of year reading test because their iStation mid-year assessment, it said if you did well enough on that, you didn't have to take that. Yet, I believe that the low scores on beginning of year reading was used as a reason for having, certain required additional, legislative required programs that are also relying heavily on testing. So I wish there were some consistency with that. But what I'm concerned about is growth is not just a one-year measurement. We're not just comparing the EVAS. I'm so sorry. I think most people have a hard time understanding, I was highly effective this year, and so great. So I know that's confusing, but it's not just a one-year thing. So I'm just thinking how this is a multiple, even waiving this for 1 year could potentially have a negative impact on an educator for more than 1 year. Am I right in that sort of?
Yeah, I think that's one of the big TBDs that we have in the system right now. But even if for some reason the pandemic disappeared tomorrow and we assessed every student this spring just like we normally had pre-pandemic, we still have a situation where we don't have any data from last year, and having a gap of a year. Just from an educator's perspective, if I get, quote, growth data for my students this year, that's going to encompass whatever they learned when they were with me, and also whatever they learned the previous year with whatever teacher or even in whatever school they may have been, because now you've got this gap where you've really got kind of a 2-year growth, not a 1-year growth. And we've, rhetorically, we've always talked about how that growth belongs to the teacher and everything is annual. Well, even if you could do that this year, you can't say that that's that teacher's growth because it's now an accumulation of 2 different teachers' growth across 2 different years and potentially 2 different schools. So I think that's, there's just no way to, there's no statistical gymnastics you can do to get around that. And that's going to mean that it's going to be a little less meaningful for people than it was in the past. Despite its limitations, that's another big one that we're going to have to add to that this year in terms of people making sense out of it and potentially using it for things like paying teacher bonuses, or identifying teachers for any other kind of recognition. So it's going to be very difficult to make that work in a meaningful way.
Thank you for that explanation. It certainly is a big consideration. And then even looking at low performing school designations, we all know the overlap of the larger the number of lower test scores, the larger percentage of students at those schools experiencing poverty. That has not gone away in the pandemic. That will never go away until we address problems with standardized testing. And thank you.
You're welcome.
Ms. Carter?
Yeah, thank you. I just had a clarification question because I know a lot for the high schools in the fall, they had to do like the medical exemption. So that seems to be a little different though now. It just seems whatever the process is, if it's a Google form or whatever that school is using, then they don't have to go through that additional step. I just wanted clarification, I guess, around that since that's what some had to do.
No, that's a really good question. We are still collecting medical exemption information from students as we normally would for the kinds of conditions for which medical exemptions are normally granted. We are submitting them to the state. We are getting rulings on those. However, if we don't necessarily get one from a student, say a VA student, and they don't necessarily come in, the end result of that, because we're wrapping up the school year, is going to be the same. Back in the fall, when we were collecting those exemptions, the expectation was that those students would have the opportunity to maybe test again in the spring if the pandemic conditions improved such that they felt more comfortable coming into school. But, we're kind of up against the end of the year at this point, so we can't necessarily wait too much longer. And so, but we are still collecting those, and we are still trying to gauge, at least within schools, which students are requesting them, for which we need to submit them, and which other students may not. So the process is still there. It's just that our time horizon now is shrunk pretty narrowly. So But we are collecting them because we want to be able to know how many students are choosing that option, not coming for that, versus, there's always a small number of parents at the end of the year who refuse to bring their child in for testing for reasons that have nothing to do with health, but they just object to the process or whatever. And we're suspicious that at some point we're going to get asked to provide that information to somebody. We want to make sure we have it. So we're trying to keep those processes in place.
Can I follow up on Ms. Carter's question? Do those medical exemptions count against the 95% that we're required to test? Or?
Oh, good question. Yeah, for the whole purpose of medical exemptions is to make sure that schools don't get inappropriately flagged in the system for failing to test 95% of their students when they may have students who are hospitalized and, severely impaired and not able to really go through the process. That's why the medical exemption and process exists to begin with. But since the federal government has already waived that, it's not really going to be consequential ultimately in terms of school accountability. But we're just still trying to follow the process where we can.
Thank you.
Ms. Johnson-Hosler.
Thank you. That was one of my follow-ups. The additional follow-up is for those students, both VA or in person, that don't show up. I mean, because they didn't do the form. I mean, I guess I'm trying to figure out what's the stopgap measure for families who it feels like things have changed, but which fortunately probably should note somewhere in the mailing that we are still using those medical exemption forms. So I'm wondering what's going to be the process or stopgap for those who don't submit the medical exemption form but don't show up.
And again, that's something that does happen every year. The numbers are usually pretty small, but every year we deal with that. Usually a student will be marked absent from the test. Mm-hmm. There's always a makeup day or maybe a couple of makeup days that the school sets aside for students who are ill or unable to be there on the actual day. Those students are then expected to come in for the makeup. If they don't do that, they're marked as absent from makeup. And then historically, the school has usually adjudicated that in whatever way, on a case-by-case basis with those students. For an end-of-grade test, as I mentioned, there's no consequences for a student in terms of their GPA or grade or anything. But for end-of-course and CTE courses, schools have generally handled those on kind of a case-by-case basis.
So a follow-up to that is, what if that's the case? So what are we going to do with students who chose a medical exemption last fall? That because everybody was virtual for our high schools,
yes.
But now they're in person. I mean, are we going to allow them whatever their adjudication was, because they didn't show up, let's stick with they didn't use a medical exemption, then are those kids going to then keep the incomplete, especially in our year-long courses, which are currently only 30 high schools?
Yeah, if a student's coming back face-to-face this semester, for example, then it's easy. They're there, they can take the test. But if they stayed in the virtual academy for yet another semester, have another test for which that is the case, or are still carrying that incomplete, then we've told schools to resolve those by using the same process we're using for virtual academy students come the spring and the guidance that we've sent out to schools. So I know Brian Pittman's on the call if he wants to provide any additional context or detail around that. He's welcome to do so. But that's the process we'll be encouraging schools to use to wrap up those grades for those students.
And I'm sure we're relaying this to not just our educators, but our parents as well, especially for high school, because it's such a switch from they were all virtual last year.
Yeah, I think the main thing we're trying to do is we have to offer every student the opportunity to take the test. And we are absolutely going to make sure that regardless of whether you're VA or in person, every student has every opportunity to take that test. But on the other hand, for a family who has been virtual all year, who doesn't want their student to come in, who's concerned about medical issues, we don't want them to have to make a choice between their child or their family's health and their GPA. So we're not going to let that happen.
All right. No further questions? All right. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, next up is an update on district intervention programming and school supports. Mr. Cook, good to see you this afternoon.
You as well, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. Chair Sutton, members of the board, Superintendent Moore. It is our pleasure today to share with you some plans for the 21-22 school year that we are very excited about in terms of the potential for direct and positive impact on student outcomes. As many of you know, and even as we have discussed today for some time now, many of our students had significant needs before the pandemic, and we expect that those needs are likely to be more significant and widespread upon returning from the pandemic. We've also acknowledged and discussed, again, even here today, the reality that our schools are not always fully resourced to adequately meet all of the many needs that are anticipated in the months and in the years ahead. While it's important for all of us to understand that we'll never be able to intervene or remediate or even summer learn our way out of the impacts of a multi-year pandemic, we are optimistic that the initial plans that we'll share with you over the next few minutes, which will be one component of a broader and more comprehensive strategy, will serve as a critical next step forward in resourcing and staffing our schools to better address the critical needs of all of our students. So we've shared this graphic with you previously over the past few weeks. It's possible that at some point you might get tired of seeing it. So I won't go over each of these areas again, but it is important, again, to remember the broader context of our planning and support efforts across the district. I will note that given the limited time we have allotted today, our goal is not to provide you with a comprehensive overview of intervention programming across the district, but rather our intent is to provide some quick highlights of current and planned work as we share with you some important next steps in supporting our schools in the 21-22 school year and beyond. As we consider this broader context and as we look ahead over the next few weeks, it's also worth mentioning that we do plan to bring additional updates to the board on other important academic program areas, including updates on things like AIG supports and core curriculum implementation at the next Student Achievement Committee meeting on May 24th. And Ms. Scott, I noted your question just a few minutes ago about the importance of a comprehensive assessment system, and so that's something else that we'll be bringing additional information to the board in the coming weeks as well. So again, the two desired outcomes for this presentation are: one, provide you with an overview of current intervention programming and its support to schools, particularly in light of the impacts of the pandemic over the course of the past year plus; and two, and more specifically, we'll share with you a plan for increasing the level of support to address the needs of students beginning with the 21-22 school year. So here with this graphic, anytime we talk about intervention supports, it's really important that we ground our discussion within the broader context of the MTSS framework. As you know, MTSS is a multi-tiered framework which promotes school improvement through engaging, evidence-based academic and behavioral practices. It employs a systems approach using data-driven problem solving to maximize growth for all students. Because MTSS is broad in nature, it is often helpful to view it in terms of 6 critical components, which you see here: leadership, building capacity and infrastructure for implementation, communication and collaboration, database problem solving, the 3-tiered instructional and intervention model, and data evaluation. As you can see, pulling MTSS apart into these 6 critical components provides an avenue for truly digging in to productive conversations about how we build capacity and systems and structures for supporting all students, and not just those students who are demonstrating a need for intervention. That's a common misconception sometimes when we're talking about MTSS. It truly is a comprehensive framework targeting all students to meet their individualized needs. So with that context in mind, at this time I'll turn it over to Intervention and Advanced Learning Services Director, Lakeisha Roberts, who will share more details on intervention programming and district planning moving forward. Ms. Roberts.
Good afternoon. As we approach the work of intervention team, more specifically, today we're going to look at the components of the 3-tiered instruction intervention model. This slide provides a clear understanding of how supports should be provided for academics and behavioral health at core, supplemental, and intensive levels. It is critical as we look at the graphics that we note that the labels of core, supplemental, and intensive are descriptions of instruction and not labels of students. We are continually messaging that students are not tiers. The graphic shows how support should be layered to ensure we are meeting the needs of students, a layering that is necessary for all students at various points in their learning progression. Each layer of the support uses a data-driven process intended to provide a continuum of support. Support at each level may vary in intensity, frequency, and/or duration, as it is always aligned to a student's specific academic and/or behavioral health learning needs. The data-driven process is used to support students in need of additional instruction beyond core. It is a process and not a program or a specific product. The supports are aligned to areas of need that are barriers for student achievement. The first level, core instruction, includes general academic, behavioral, and social emotional instruction and support designed and differentiated for all students. Core academic instruction should be aligned with the North Carolina Standard Course of Study, and the core behavioral and social emotional instruction should be aligned with locally developed expectations. The delivery of instruction at this level should include evidence-based practices that include whole group and small group strategies, as well as differentiated instruction based on the learners in the group. At supplemental, the students are typically grouped by similar needs and provided explicit evidence-based intervention instruction that is aligned to core. If a student is receiving supplemental interventions, they should get core instruction in addition to supplemental intervention. The classroom teacher typically provides supplemental interventions. At the intensive level, students receive evidence-based instruction that may include maximizing the intensity, frequency, and/or duration as evidenced by consistently collected data. Intensive intervention should also align to core. Students are progress monitored at all tiers to ensure they are receiving appropriate supports. Again, the levels are never intended to classify students, but a means to provide more targeted support and guide teachers on how to provide those supports. It is key to remember the goal, to provide supports in addition to core in such a way that a student moves forward to ultimately only needing core level support or first-time instruction in order to achieve success and mastery. There are many stakeholders who are involved in the process of supporting interventions. Key among these stakeholders is the intervention team facilitator at the elementary level and the intervention coordinator at the middle school and high school level. I want to give you a quick overview of what the individual in this position does, in part to provide leadership to the intervention process. As I share this with you, I want to emphasize that this is a half-time position at most of our schools. Some schools, based on their level of need, may have a full-time position. So this person's role includes providing intensive interventions in all areas, reading, math, and behavioral health. The role of this person also is to facilitate database problem solving and to ensure the documentation of all interventions are aligned to student-specific area of need, while ensuring a student is responding to the interventions that are provided. The additional supports will allow for this position to be full-time and allow for teachers to receive support with instruction for students who may have had a hard time with the content. As a district, we feel strongly that it is important to better resource schools to address this need. As you have heard from Mr. Nieder and the finance team, a portion of the federal ESSER funds are specifically earmarked to support and address lost learning opportunities. This increase in intervention support is one part of a greater design to proactively address lost learning opportunities while ensuring a better outcome for our populations that may have been greatly impacted by an interruption in formal learning. As a part of our effort to do that, we will be adding 15 months of employment or 1.5 positions to schools across the district to increase the capacity of schools to address this work. This is a new allocation and does not replace or repurpose an existing resource. Our goal in doing this is not focused on a deficit model. Rather, we are focused on maintaining and restoring opportunities for acceleration and growth because we believe firmly that all of our students are capable of great success. We fully acknowledge that this is an aspirational goal. 15 months of employment will not eliminate gaps or disproportionality. It will not bring all students to grade level, but it will take a significant step forward in supporting students to meet their various needs. In the 3-year time, we will evaluate our current structures to make sure that at the end of the 3 years, progress is sustainable and the status quo has been interrupted. This time will give us opportunities to evaluate our current structures to make sure our systems truly reflect responses needed to ensure the success of students who may need support at the supplemental and/or intensive levels. After speaking with many principals, it was clear that providing additional personnel is a critical need as they anticipate barriers schools will face when trying to ensure students receive the supports they need. As mentioned before, this will not replace the need for strong core instruction, but as stated by a principal, additional intervention months are going to be essential and critical. The plan is to increase supplemental and/or intensive supports as a way to minimize the number of students needing supports beyond core. As we know, we cannot intervene our way out of core. What we mean by that is students still require sound, strong core instruction. The intended outcome is to make core more accessible to students who may have needs and provide opportunities that changes a student's potential trajectory positively. With the additional support, schools will have the opportunity to provide increased direct instruction to students requiring supplemental and/or intensive support, to cross-collaborate with a variety of stakeholders, such as ESL, AIG, counseling, to ensure students receive supports to advance, not to just gain proficiency. And then to work in conjunction with the intervention team facilitator / coordinator and the classroom teacher. Although the pandemic presented many challenges, these additional personnel can provide schools with an opportunity not to just meet the needs of students who may have struggled in the past, but to provide a trajectory beyond just reaching proficiency. I will now pass it to Drew for dialogue and questions.
Thank you, Lakeisha. So as we move into discussion and questions, it is important, just a couple of final reminders, to keep in mind that the work that Ms. Roberts has described just now is just one component of what will be a broader strategy that will guide how we're supporting our students. This is a plan for enhancing how we address intervention, but this work will be very interconnected with the broader planning and action steps that we take across the district. Also, in the next 3 years, our goal, as mentioned before, is not focused on a purely deficit model. To be clear, we believe that all of our students are capable of success despite the unprecedented challenges that have been thrust upon them over the course of the past year plus. Among other steps moving forward, we will be sharing more details with schools and providing them with some specific guidance and parameters on the use of how these additional MOE can be used in order to ensure that we're maximizing to the greatest degree possible the effectiveness of the support being provided to our students. So at this time, we're happy to take any feedback, comments, or questions that you might have.
Mrs. Scott.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I appreciate that. I think anytime we can also clarify MTSS and bring that to the public, it helps them better understand the process that's used within our schools, or that's ideally being utilized to serve our students. So I have kind of a two-part question, and I'll start with saying that during our board advisory council meeting that we had, one of the suggestions from schools, from feedback, was that it would be great for some positions like assistant principals, guidance counselors, to not just be based on the number of students within schools, but if we could look to a way of basing that also with a need within that. And I think MTSS and perhaps tracking where's the number of students being served on which tier could possibly be an indicator for that. So I'm just kind of throwing that out. But if you could help me sort of visualize this, that I would greatly appreciate it. I have a friend who has a relative who operates a school And they have a position in that school where this person goes around and observes children in every classroom, and every student has sort of like a best practices plan that follows them, where the teacher, the coach observes the child, then shares with the teacher, when you're working with the student, these are things that would help this student perform better, help make them feel more comfortable, keep them more involved, they just sort of giving strategies for like each and every student. Certainly not suggesting that that's what this position would be like, but could you help me picture what this would look like within a school?
Yes, ma'am, and thank you, Ms. Scott. That's a great question and an important question, and I'll let Lakeisha share a little bit more in detail in terms of the roles and responsibilities of the instructional facilitator, the intervention facilitator, and also the intervention coordinator. In a lot of ways, though, what I can say, generally speaking, is that these staff members work closely with classroom teachers. They work closely with parents. They work closely with counselors, with social workers, with administrators, all with the united purpose to identify data points that indicate that there are students that need additional supplemental or more intensive intervention. And so to your point, sometimes, Ms. Scott, that would involve them being in the classroom where instruction is being provided and where learning is taking place. Sometimes that means they're sitting down and meeting with administrators and counselors and pouring into student-level data to prioritize and make decisions about which students need what supports and when and how often. And so I think in a lot of ways these positions are really seen as kind of a glue that focuses entirely on student outcomes, particularly for those that are having difficulty succeeding at the level that we know that they can. And certainly, Ms. Roberts, feel free to jump in and provide more details if that was a little bit too broad.
No, that's exactly correct, Drew. So this position would support schools as far as their supplemental and intensive students by hands-on working with students, as Drew mentioned. It would definitely include sitting with PLTs to just problem solve on specific area of needs of students, and then actually being a pair of hands that could go into the classroom to help provide those supports to students. So not only is this person doing observations of how students are performing, they're also instructing students, which is going to be the valuable resource for schools.
Thank you.
Ms. Cash.
Yeah, Mr. Cook, thank you for this. So on page 7, when it says our goal is to address lost opportunity for learning from the pandemic, all children lost opportunities. So we're picking a specific group, not all of our students?
That's a great question. So I think that some use the term, even the state uses the term learning loss. We're not using that term because I think to some degree that reflects on the student as if they have done or not done something that they should do. And so I think we've been really purposeful and intentional in using the language exactly as you just described, Ms. Cash, in part because it really is about deficits or gaps that have been either created or in some cases, let's be honest, exacerbated pre-pandemic, right? And I think it's important for us to just go into this with the mindset that this is not about what a student did or did not do at any point in time over the past year. And so I think it's important for us to kind of remember and recognize it really is about the lost opportunity. But to your point, right, that process means that we then have to dig into cause and effect. You know, one of the greatest challenges we have right now, and goes back to Ms. Scott's question a little bit earlier, we are in a phase where schools are working feverishly to take stock in what gaps or skill deficits students might have at a time when it's still really challenging to determine, was this an instructional issue, right? Was it a technology issue? Was it the fact that they spent 6 months out of the building? Is that the causality of whatever deficits may be occurring? Or is it really, a processing issue? Or is it something else that might have been in existence prior to the pandemic that's manifesting itself in a much more concrete way? And so I think that gives you a little bit of a window into just how much depth and detail is required and will be required for our teachers and for our support staff, including these positions, to really zero in on what our students need. And I think that's a huge challenge. That's another reason we'll be coming back to you with additional information, because when we're talking about curriculum and instruction in 21, 22, and beyond, a critical component of that is going to be a comprehensive, balanced assessment system that helps our teachers determine exactly what it is that our students need. And it's really hard right now, and it has been, to kind of parse out and control for all the variables that are no doubt having an impact and have to this point on student learning.
So, yeah, so you said that really well. I appreciate that. That was a very, very good answer. Thank you so much. If students say, I mean, some of our students we're seeing in our emergency rooms are students that were probably A and B students and are fallen to a C or a D, and they can't handle that because they're expected to go to a college they've been working on for so long. Is there, these kids may not have interventions in place for them because they fail as much as any other student, but they don't fall into the failed zone yet, but they feel like they've failed. Well, are we helping them?
That's a great question. And so I'll actually extend that. I'll complicate that a little more. Because the reverse of that challenge, Ms. Cash, is that it is likely the case that there are some students that perhaps have outperformed in some ways what would be expected traditionally, right? They have thrived in the environment, right? And sometimes I think it's legitimate for, next year's teacher, for example, who has a group of students that are walking in with all A's and B's. I think an obvious and fair and honest question is, are those A's and B's truly reflective of what student learning has occurred? And I think the only way to do that is to dig into the data, conduct things like formative pre-assessments across the board in reading and math and other core subject areas to identify what some of those needs are. And I think, to your point, doing so will help us identify not just those students who have fallen below the line, quote unquote, but maybe those that ordinarily would stay off the radar because maybe they made B's for the first time in their life. And so I think it's going to be important to make sure that we're targeting those students as well, even though I think it would be very easy, to the point of your question, for them to kind of be lost in the shuffle if we're not really, really careful and intentional about avoiding exactly that.
I want to thank you. You always understand so well. I appreciate that so well. Thank you so much.
So if I could piggyback on that a little bit and maybe complicate that even further.
I may regret saying that, but
I mean, I think it's great that we're adding, seeing 15 months allocated to each school. But just like when we think about growth in our district, and growth isn't evenly spread across the district, I can see where some schools will have greater levels of need than some others. How will we approach this from a more, I guess, when thinking about an equity versus equal standpoint, and being more responsive to the needs of each school, where there might be just an even greater need, and then therefore need more, if I'm using some of the same language in here, even more intensive levels of support at a particular school? Do we have the resources to then provide additional positions on top of the one at each, or will we have some ability to pull from one and add to another, where perhaps we don't need as much over here and need more over here? What sort of flexibility or responsiveness will we have in that regard? 'Cause like I said, I can see where the needs of every school will not be the same.
Yes, sir, and that's an outstanding question, and I can assure you one that we have and will be visiting regularly. I think, first of all, to your point, these are additional months of employment, additional positions that we're looking to add on top of a baseline that has been established. And in some respects, we already have, previous to the pandemic, established additional criteria. I think, to your point, for example, just outside of raw student enrollment numbers when allotting months of employment. And so in some ways, we've already got some level of differentiation when it comes to need and providing and targeting those resources. I think it's fair to say we've got additional work to do in the months and years ahead in how we go about that and how we do that. And of course, that's a tough decision-making process sometimes when you have to explain to a principal, for example, why their school might not be getting the same allotment as another school. And so with all of that context, I will say the real intent here, and again, I'll say it as a first step, is to raise that minimum baseline for all schools, recognizing that there's additional work to be done beyond what's already occurred to really differentiate and target that support in a way that maximizes its impact where it really needs to be felt. And I think it's fair to say that we've gotten quite a bit of feedback and input from our principals over the last couple weeks in arriving at this proposal. And that's been part of the feedback as well. I think the question mark that we'll have to answer in the months and years ahead is what data points, again, going back to data, what data points will we use to make some tough decisions about perhaps differentiating the level of support that every school gets. And we referenced the 15 months, and I think that's a broad brush. I'll note that, when we're talking about early colleges, for example, in some of our smaller schools, it might not be that same level in part because of exactly what you're describing based on the need there. But I think we absolutely have an obligation moving forward further to further differentiate and delineate what school needs are.
Well, I sort of struggle with even asking the question because I can appreciate the effort to at least establish a baseline across the district first. So I get it. Thanks for that.
So I could just add one more piece to that. You'll recall early in the presentation, Ms. Roberts indicated that all schools receive a half-time position for an intervention coordinator. The point of this 15 MOE is to allow that position be at least a full-time position and then have an additional position that can be used depending on how the school may meet those needs. Separate from that half-time position, all schools receive intervention MOE based on the number of students that have needs in their building. So there's two sort of separate sets of allotments there. So they already have a differentiated pot of MOE that they get to serve students. And then they each get a half position to coordinate schools. And this additional 15 months will support that being a full-time position and then additional position that can either also help coordinate or be a part of the other MOE.
Mr. Haggerty.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to take Mr. Sutton's question, but instead I'm going to take it in a different direction, looking inward and inside the school. So we talk about this being a comprehensive framework for all students. And we know that during the pandemic, some of the hardest students to serve remotely have been our special needs students. So with MTSS, for example, where does special education fit in? And will, like, the 15 MOE that we're providing, will that be for staff that's trained to serve those students or to identify those needs?
Great question, Mr. Haggerty. So I think, first of all, the answer broadly is yes to your question. In terms of the intent and the purpose of the position, they absolutely should do and will be serving all of our students, including perhaps our most vulnerable that have individualized needs. And again, going back to the purpose of these positions particularly, they work I didn't mention this category before. They work closely with case managers, with special education services to ensure that, number one, that core instruction is being provided at a level that is suitable for that student, and that any individualized needs that are spelled out in an IEP are being met. And that's, I think that's important to recognize. That occurs irrespective of a designation of having an IEP. But I think it's safe to say, and it's fair to say, those students absolutely are part of that focus. And then I think to your second question, and this may be where Lakeisha wants to add more detail in terms of the qualifications or the type of person that we're looking for to fill these roles. I think certainly staff members who have a background in things like literacy instruction, if they happen to have a background in special education, I think that can be a positive as well. But I think in terms of identifying staff to fill these needs, I think we're confident that we'll be able to identify folks who are the right fit, that have a heart for students, that also are organized and efficient in their understanding of MTSS, and can also really dig into data and make sure that we're looking at the right data points and then leveraging that to make whatever adjustments to instruction might be necessary. And Lakeisha, you may have more insight specific to Mr. Haggerty's question in terms of kind of the profile of who we're looking for to fill these positions.
Absolutely. So as Drew had mentioned, we are looking for someone who has all of those skill sets. And typically that is a person with a teacher classification. So we're looking at someone that's able to look at those data points and make sound decisions about instructional practices. A lot of times schools already have people in their building that they are, have employed for intervention team facilitator, intervention coordinator, as well as have timing it with another position. So usually the schools already have these people in mind, but a lot of times they are your strong teachers who have strong data content knowledge.
Ms. Carter.
Thank you. And I guess I wanted to, and I don't know if this is kind of ties in, but it might be going off track. So just tell me I'm off track. That's fine. But
No, ma'am, I won't tell you that.
One of the things I say is underneath the high school is about strategies to improve the high school graduation rate. And I guess in speaking with several educators and just the concern I have around so many of the students that have, just to put it all out there, are supporting their families now, okay? So, and are we as a district, or are we leaving this up to schools to kind of carry the weight, or are we as a district going to make intentional steps on ways to address students who are at the high school level and one legally can drop out and may be looking at, now carrying a full-time job due to being out of the building for extended time, and then also students who just, due to being out of the building so long, have disconnected, unengaged, that kind of thing. Are we making very intentional steps here, somewhere else, and getting a little more creative, I guess, for lack of better term, around what we can do to serve them and try to get them back engaged and on track to graduate? Thank you.
Yes, ma'am, and thank you for the question. So absolutely critical, right, to the future trajectory of our students. A couple of thoughts that I would share. First of all, I think if you look back over the last 6 to 8 years in our district and seeing our graduation rates across all subgroups steadily increase year after year after year. That doesn't happen unless there's some level of intentionality comprehensively across the district and systematically. But I think to your point, one of the things that we have focused on, and I think we've always got room for growth. I mean, a 90% graduation rate means 10% of our students aren't graduating on time. And as significant an accomplishment for our students in our community as that 90% rate was in 2020, it still means that, we had roughly 1,000 students that didn't graduate on time. And so I think it's one of the things that our schools do systematically, and people like Brian Pittman and Lakeisha, both of whom are, on this call, work intensively with our high schools to help create not anecdotal strategies, right? And that's part of what MTSS is really all about. I can recall even in my own experience as a high school principal, we had counselors in some instances that had phenomenal practices in the ways they followed up with students and provided things like attendance contracts and flexible opportunities. But the problem was that didn't always happen, at least initially, consistently across the board for all students. And so things that, and just imagine extrapolating that out to the broader district in all of our schools. You can imagine, you don't have to imagine, right? We know that there's variance. And so I think one of the things that we absolutely want to continue to do are identifying, for example, every student at the beginning of the school year who is exactly 8 credits away from graduating. In other words, they have 0 room for error. Having them on a case list, whether they're a student with an IEP or not. Somebody in that building is aware of who they are and what supports they might need, and somebody to keep up with them and keep track of it. In some cases, it might also be the student who's 10 credits short as they start the year, who, if it was not for the intentional hard work of administrators, counselors, teachers, and social workers, wouldn't think to say, you know what, we're going to find you a way to get that additional credit both in the fall and the spring, right, so that you can graduate on time with your class. And so I think things like that, tracking data when we talk about it, database problem solving, sometimes I think, it sounds really nice, but nobody really knows exactly what that means. When we're talking about graduating students on time, it means digging deeper than the overall rate for that school. It means digging deeper than a subgroup rate. It means literally, whether it's a counselor, a social worker, an intervention coordinator, an assistant principal, a teacher, it means literally going line by line, sometimes, believe it or not, still with a ruler, line by line, going down a caseload, whether it's a formal caseload or informal, and keeping track of exactly where every student is in their progression. And so that, that was a long-winded response in some ways to a pretty direct question, but I think it's important to say both there are some systemic structures in place, but I think to the point of the proposal that we're sharing with you, there's a lot of work to be done to get to the level that we need to be at. And you need to look no further than even our data from 2020, which is as great as that increase was, it still shows there's a tremendous amount of work left to be done.
All right, thank you. Yes, I'm just trying to make sure the schools aren't carrying the entire burden that we are trying to help. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
So I've got about 5 more minutes I can allow for this discussion because we've got to get to the last item on our work session on the 7-year plan. So, Ms. Kushner.
Thank you. And I wanted to underscore my agreement with Ms. Carter on the focus on high school graduations. And I thank you for this presentation, Mr. Cook. And I think you're exactly right, because I think in this pandemic, the greatest risk for our students are a student that fails to get that graduation accomplished, because that has such lifelong ramifications for those students. So I appreciate you raising those issues, because I think that's a keen, I was glad to see the focus on those strategies. And I know that we've had such great progress in closing gaps among some groups and graduation rates. It's important for us to keep that going. So thank you for that answer to her question.
Yes, ma'am.
Mrs. Cash.
Well, I just want to say, I can stay within HIPAA guidelines here when I say this, but so I just want to say that when I was in the room with one of our distressed students, I don't know for sure, I left when the high school counselor was coming in the door to see him, but that was great, to see that. But that child probably wouldn't have been a need in our school. It would not have been a child that registered as a need for us. But I did see a high school counselor coming in to take care of that need that day. So I want to say kudos to that.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
All right. Any further discussion from the board on this topic? All right. Thank you, Mr. Cook. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, our last item on today's work session, approval of the 7-year capital improvement plan as a resolution requesting funds for that same plan. So, Mr. Nate, I guess we're skipping right past you and going straight to Mr. Congdon. All right.
And we'll just wait for the slide deck to be brought up, please. Good afternoon, everyone.
Afternoon, sir.
Pleasure to be with you all.
Good to see you today.
All right, I think we're there. Good afternoon, Chair Sutton, Superintendent Moore, and board members. Thank you for the opportunity to be here with you all this afternoon. Next slide, please. Presentation purpose today, this afternoon, is to share the final version of the 2021 Capital Improvement Plan update with you all. Next slide, please. Take a moment here. We'll talk about our review timeline, just to take a moment to look back at where we've come from and how we've arrived here today. A couple comments as we start. Number one, our space standards and legs. We have no changes to those this year. Those were discussed and reviewed, as well as the program assumptions with our facility committee in February of 2021. Going on to the rubric prioritization, this discussion started late last year in November of 2020. We then proceeded to come back to committee in February with a revision to address feedback and comments that we received in that first meeting. We then came back a second time in March with additional refining of that rubric to address questions and feedback from the February meeting. A presentation was provided to you all with respect to student enrollment in March of this year. We went to Facilities Committee in March of 21 to share the cost model update for this year. We then went back to committee and shared the executive summary and also a revised executive summary in the months of March and April of 2021. That takes us here today. We've now arrived at our presentation this afternoon with you all for the 2021 final capital improvement plan. Next slide, please. On this slide, you'll notice that this is an update. This will provide you information with respect to the summary of our new schools. It's important to note that in the years 22 through 27, we've made no changes. You'll note that in fiscal year 28, we have shared that there are $58 million for a to-be-determined elementary school, in fact, 2 of them in the out year. There's a total of 8 schools, new schools, that are under the design and construction category. There are 6 of them that are in funding for construction, and then there is 1 for design funding. Also would like to note that in fiscal years 22 and 23, there is funding shown for Felton Grove High School. As you all are aware, there was a public hearing last week in Apex. It did not pass. We're keeping it in the plan at this point as the board is still discussing the options and the possibilities of what the path forward might look for that particular school. So note that that's why this is still shown in this year's CIP. Next slide, please. We now move on to our renovation summary. You'll note specifically that, again, no changes in fiscal years 22 through 27, and we've added in fiscal year 28 $60 million for a renovation to be determined. Could be elementary, middle, or high school, and that is to be determined at this point in time. We have a total of 3 schools in the design and construction funding category. We have 2 schools in the construction funding category, and then we have 1 school in the design and partial construction funding. Next slide, please. In this slide, we share with you the program requirement summary. One thing of particular note that I'd like to share is that in fiscal years 22 and 23, we did receive good news from our partner, Wake County. The tax revenue for the year came in better than expected, and as a result, the county has notified and advised that they're able to provide us back $5 million in cash in both years, fiscal year 22 and 23. This was discussed at the most recent committee meeting, recommended and agreed that it go back in the SNAP line item, as last year when that funding came out, it was removed from that particular funding bucket. With respect to 23 through 27, no other changes to report. We have shown, of course, fiscal year 28 in this update. I think it's important to note that over time, you'll notice certainly an increase in funding with life cycle, and specifically if you look at next year in comparison to fiscal year 25, there's a doubling approximately of funds in that particular category, which we can all agree is very important. As you look further down, you'll also note a similar trend with respect to PRIMP, again, also a very important category. And you'll notice by fiscal year 25 that the funding is about approximately 4 times what it would look like in the early years of the update. Next slide, please. In this slide, you'll notice we've provided a summary. Moving from top to bottom, you'll notice that in the new school category, we're at $1.18.6 billion over the 7-year period. Moving down, $342.9 million over the 7-year time period for the renovations, existing schools. As we continue down, you'll notice near the bottom, the program requirements total is slightly over $1 billion. It's $1,021.7 billion. That takes us to a grand total of $2,483.1, which is noted at the bottom right-hand corner of this particular slide. Next slide, please. In this slide, we speak to next steps. Presuming that you all received this favorably this afternoon, this would be on a consent agenda for this evening for the board to approve. Looking forward to our planned activities beyond this evening and into the rest of this year. With respect to item number 1, there is a discussion and a Q&A that is planned at the May 12th Facilities Committee meeting for the facility utilization report. For items 2 through 4, these are items that were discussed and raised by the board last year. Our planning team has spent time looking at each of those 3 items, which are the review of locker use reduction, collaboration space, and high school classroom size standards, and they are coming to the May 12th Facility Committee meeting, and we'll be prepared to share that with the committee. With respect to number 5, which is our SNAP print prioritization rubric, as I expressed earlier in the presentation, we worked through the existing rubric with you all in the months of November of last year, February, and March of this year. As we moved beyond that, our team has been working behind the scenes to work on that particular item, and we'll be prepared to go back to committee this summer with a further update. Lastly would be item 6. As you recall, this was an item that we talked about in committee earlier this year. We did not make a recommendation. This is an item that we're still working on with respect to flexible space that would be a care center. It's important to note that we would not be adding space. We would be utilizing that within the existing square footage. That's an item, again, that the team is working on, and we would be prepared to go back to committee to share more detail in fall of 2021. Also important to note, as a result of the environment the students and staff are currently working in with technology, we did share that the ratio for technology, which was previously 3-to-1, was recommended to change and be updated to 1-to-1. Okay? Happy to take any questions, comments, or feedback from you all.
All right. As Chair, thank you, Mr. Condon, for that report. As Chair of Facilities, Dr. Martin, I recognize you first.
Thank you, and thank you, Douglas, and everybody for all the work. Really pleased to see how this has come together. Just wondered if you could add just a little bit of comment about the discussions with the core team with the county. We're working really hard to make sure that there's sort of no surprises with this kind of 7-year rolling plan. But if you wouldn't mind just some comment about how the core team has looked at this and how is the county sort of in agreement as far as we know at this
Certainly.
point.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. Great question. We do work closely with our core team. We do meet with them monthly. I also have the opportunity on a monthly basis to dialogue with the CFO, Emily Lucas, to ensure that we are all working on the same wavelength. As we have met weekly, we've been sharing this plan, and prior to even bringing it to committee, we did share it with the county to ensure that they had the opportunity to review, provide any comment and feedback, and to ensure that they were in agreement with and in line with what we were going to be bringing to you today.
Thank you. I think it's just really important that collaborative work, it's helped us to do better long-range planning.
Agreed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Haggerty.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation, Douglas. I do have a couple questions here. The first thing is just about the CIP in general, and I think it's difficult for people who are interested in this subject to find information out about it. If you go to the website and you look for information about the current CIP, much of the information is very dated. You'll see proposed new schools like Willow Springs and Parkside Academy, which are now in operation. And so, I want to make sure that we're not putting out stuff that, too early, right? But I want to be transparent about where we are in the process so that people can learn about where new school construction is planned and what our plans are. Specifically, like in the presentation tonight, we list 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 schools just by number. Now, one of them has Capitol Boulevard site next to it, so it's pretty clear that's probably the Bobby Murray site. But among the others, do we have a map, or is there anything that we could share in terms of, where these are, just to reinforce that these are priority areas of growth, or anything like that?
I think we could certainly do that. I mean, that's certainly, I think, a visual aid that would be helpful, and we could certainly try to provide something of that nature.
Great. I mean, even if it's just a description of a neighborhood, but a map in particular would be really helpful.
Sure.
One thing we have talked about, and I don't know how it fits into the development of the CIP, but is the need for swing space. And I know here you've identified some sites that I think from the middle schools that could be where new middle schools will be constructed that could serve as swing space for other middle schools. And it may now, with the time we have, may not be the appropriate place for it, but maybe at a future facilities committee meeting, I'd like to know kind of how we make the determination of when to invest in new swing space. One of the things that came out of our discussion at the last facilities committee meeting was the important balance between the construction of new schools to accommodate new growth in some areas of the county and the importance of balancing that with renovations in existing facilities. And I think, this plan, you break it down really well, where we do have renovations planned and how we'll use that. But key to those renovations is having the availability of that swing space. So you're not sending students all the way across the county to get the improvements they need at their schools. And then finally, just as you know, this week we've had the announcement of Apple moving to RTP in the Triangle. We had a presentation at our last board meeting from Downtown South talking about a development that could bring 16,000 residential new units into Southeast Raleigh. And do you know, has there been any discussion with anyone on the core team about whether or not there could be another school bond coming in the future to help us catch up with this new wave of growth that we're expecting?
So that's, and thank you, Mr. Hager. Thank you for your great questions. Related to your most recent question, your last question, that is a conversation that we've had with respect to the upcoming bond in the 22 ballot, and it's something that Emily and I have talked about specifically, and then on a grander scale at the most recent core team meeting last month, we talked about strategically starting to get together and dialogue as a group what that means, because it's important, that message is going to have to be refined. It's going to be important that the message is out there to the voters that really aligns with what their needs are and what their wants are. So to answer your question, yes, we're having the beginnings of that conversation, and we intend to have that continued dialogue and refine that message over the next year.
Wonderful. I appreciate that, and thank you for all your hard work.
Thank you.
Mrs. Cash.
So I have so many questions. I'm not going to answer any of them or ask any of them. But will we be going through this again at our facilities meeting with Dr. Martin and the committee? We're going to vote on it tonight, I know. I'm not holding it up. But there's so much about improvement versus new facilities, and just kind of some of the program models that I'm thinking about, like when we got into the pandemic time, so many people were talking about wanting more outdoor collaboration space versus indoor collaboration. So I think we probably have program assumptions in here that we might want to revisit. If that's something we'll be able to do at facilities.
So that is an ongoing process, Ms. Cash. I think we had some of that discussion when we went through the planning assumptions. I think that was 2 or 3 facilities meetings ago, and that was part of the goal of our long-range planning discussion. What are things that need to get on the table? So just like this is a 7-year rolling plan, I think we need to see these issues as an ongoing discussion. So we need to get this approved so it can get to the commissioners, because that's part of the ongoing process. But absolutely, this is an ongoing discussion.
If I could maybe add, if we start with the last slide, 8, that shows next steps in terms of some things that are planned over the next few months. If there are things that you do not see on that slide that you think would be helpful for Facilities Committee and the board to review, that would be a place to provide some feedback, because there's already some fur and capping stuff that's got to come, conversations about lockers and use and reduction there, collaboration spaces, classroom space standards, print prioritization, rubric for print and SNAP. Those are all things that are in that last slide. But if you see something that's missing that you want us to make sure that we get, then, yep. So.
All right. Seeing no further discussion, this item is on our agenda for tonight for approval as a final 2021 update. So thank you, Mr. Congdon.
Thank you all very much.
All right, with that wraps up our work session agenda. I thought there would have been a little bit more discussion the time around that, so I appreciate that. So we will go ahead and adjourn our work session, and we'll look to see you all back in a few minutes, starting at 5:30 for our regular scheduled board meeting. We stand adjourned. Thank you very much.